Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Breach, and I am the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of California and our Education Fund. And I'm very excited to have you all on the webinar today. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking to you a little bit about why we're doing this work and how this project came to be. But before I do that, I just want to give our brilliant and talented presenters an opportunity to introduce themselves. So Jen, can I start with you?
Yeah, hello everyone. That was me in the beginning, at the top of the hour. Bottom of the hour. My name is Jennifer Pay. I am the project manager for voter service and education for the League of Women Voters of California Education Fund. Welcome.
Thank you, Jen. Whitney?
I'm Whitney Quisenberry from the Center of Civic Design. With Dana Chisnell, I ran the research that led to the manual we're talking about.
Thank you, Whitney. And last but by no means least, our main presenter for this webinar, Drew.
Yeah, hi, I'm Drew Davies. I own Oxide Design Co. We serve as the visual design arm of the Center for Civic Design. So we've been in charge of doing the layout and visual design that bring all the research of this project to life.
Great, thank you so much. So before they get into all the kind of the great learnings and tidbits that you're going to take away from you over the next hour, I just want to share with you that the League just had the wonderful opportunity to celebrate our 95th birthday, and that is kind of 95 years of the League's history of advocating to expand and protect the right to vote. And here in California, a really significant part of that is done through using education and engagement strategies to kind of grow the electorate and grow participation. And really some of our main and primary partners in that work are not just community organizations, but also our registrars and our election officials across the state, both at the state level and at the county level. And it's that kind of commitment to not just kind of stemming the the decline of participation that we've seen. I mean, we all saw the November numbers, and with only 31% of eligible Californians voting, we don't just want to stem the decline in participation. We also want to address this growing gap in who is participating, and really address the unfortunate reality that our electorate is not reflective of our evolving states demographics. To that end, we thought it was we thought it was a wonderful opportunity to really look at what is the role that official voting information can play in that. And we were incredibly fortunate to get to partner with the Center for Civic Design, who was our primary partner and the lead researcher in this work, as well as the Future of California Elections, which is a collaborative made up of good government groups, social justice groups, and also election officials. And lastly, was really supported with an incredibly generous grant from the James Irvine Foundation. So I cannot thank all of those groups enough. And the purpose behind the research and the subsequent manual that hopefully you've all had a chance to look at is we wanted to create an easy-to-use resource that would help election officials work to more effectively educate Californians' diverse electorate. And to that end, the initiative is designed to make voter information more effective, more inviting, and more useful. One thing that I will say is we recognize that many of the things we're going to talk about are already in play in one or more counties across California. Some of the things that we're going to suggest are also really simple fixes, but some things are not. Some things may face regulatory issues, legislative issues, or even more commonly, I think, financial barriers. The League is very well aware of the fact that our registrars and our election officials are not sitting on piles of cash to build the Taj Mahal of voting information. When you identify, or if you identify that there's potentially some barrier, we hope you'll bring that to our attention, because we're committed over the long haul to helping address those regulatory, legislative, and financial barriers, and to really doing whatever we can to kind of help you deliver the best possible resources to your voters that you can. So please see us as a resource for that, and even if you are just interested in kind of having a conversation about what you're doing, what resources may be available to help, or how issues that you're having and whether or not there's some way that we can support you, don't hesitate to kind of call up the League and schedule a time to talk with us. Before I sign off, I just want to thank everybody again for participating. I hope that this will just be I hope that you'll also attend the next two workshops, because they're all going to be a little different, and they're all covering different content. And I just hope everybody has a really great hour. Thanks so much, and I'll turn it back over to you, Jen.
part of the background that Melissa is providing is we want to raise and increase voter confidence and participation, and we have to recognize that we must learn how voters get information, and particularly voter information in the form of voter guides, and how to implement the best practices for these voter guides. And so that's why we're presenting this series of webinars. The first, earlier today, provided the full overview of not only the research and the project itself, but what the main insights and recommendations that came out of that research. For today's webinar, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into one of those theme areas, which is around layout and design. And so we're going to give some tips for how to employ design and layout to make voter information guides easy to use. So what is that going to look like? Incorporating a roadmap and building that roadmap so people can find information along the way and guiding voters along the way. Icons and illustrations, making information easy to recognize, identify, and use. And then the typography. What kind of text is actually legible for people and easy to read, and trying to make it that as simple as possible.
Thanks for bearing with us. As Jen noted, there's three main sections to what I want to cover today. They don't usually let me talk, so I'm the behind-the-scenes guy. I like to get to explain some of these visual parts, though, when I'm given the chance. We're going to go through three parts, and as Jen noted, we're going to stop for questions at the end of each section, just so you have a chance. If you've had a couple of things come up along the way, we're happy to answer those. In this layout and navigation section, the main thing we're talking about here is the idea about giving readers a roadmap, the same way that they'd have if they were driving somewhere they didn't know how to get, giving them the opportunity to look up information they need and find it right where they first expect it to be. First main point of that, and this is really the biggest, broadest point I'll make about any of the design and visual layout you can do on your voter information at all, and that is this idea about being consistent. So that's consistency on a year-to-year basis, where even something as simple as the fact that the cover of the guide is the same in 2012 as it is in 2014 as it is in 2016 lets people know that the same guide has shown up. They know what to expect might be in there. They know if it came last year and it looked like that, it came this year and it looks the same, it's probably going to have some similar information. They've already got their bearing. And the other is really a consistency within that same document. So using the same kind of visual design to signify certain elements throughout a document so that when a reader sees one of those elements, they know it's going to represent a certain specific thing. One of the main ways we can get that idea across is this idea that we call using layout to convey content. If you were in the webinar from earlier today, you heard Whitney say when we did a lot of the research on this, communicating with voters and showing them previous voter guides from various counties across the state, they honed in on 5 of their most favorite pages, the ones they really gravitated towards. And one of the things that we noted about all of those pages is that they're doing a great job of using layout to convey content. And that is to say, the actual placement of elements on those pages begins to communicate the type of content they are. The simplest way to illustrate that is the idea that the calendar page shows a traditional calendar grade graphic that people saw and they recognized, okay, this is going to be the page that gives me the dates. That 4 ways to vote page is sectioned into these 4 key blocks instead of just being rows and rows of text. It was clear that there were these 4 separate ways you could go about voting. The other nice thing about this is that we can use that same layout, the placement of those elements, to differentiate these page types from one another, so that when a voter is reading through a guide, they know that this type of page is distinctly different from that type simply because of the way the layout functions, as opposed to every page in the guide being 2 columns of text that run from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. We had great success in our testing also with really simplifying this idea about a roadmap, putting a very clear table of contents at the start of a voter guide that actually walked them through specifically, even not just saying table of contents, but literally labeling that what's in this guide, and walking them through those very key questions and really sectioned into those 2 pieces where we let them know there's really 2 parts to this guide. One is about the ways that you vote, and the other is about what are all of the pieces of content that are going to be on the ballot, and then breaking down the steps after those. We saw in the user testing we were doing on this, we saw the participants regularly referring back to this page. They would actually hold their finger in that spot, and then when we asked them to find another piece of data, they'd go back to this table of contents and use it to actually help find where they were going. So we're seeing that that's really critical key in terms of usability and getting people to the places they want to get in the document. Beyond that is this idea about showing readers where they are. And this seems a little bit obvious, but at the same time we saw sometimes it can be easy to kind of slip out of this and assume that if a reader is at a certain point in the document, they just know where they're already at. They know they're in the explanation of a local ballot measure. But in reality, what we're suggesting you do is put an easy, clear, bold heading at the top of every page that literally labels what's going to be on that page, and continue to do that even if a topic such as the explanation of local ballot measure E extends across multiple pages. So use running headings to connect those parts of the section so that a reader can continue to find, okay, this topic covers these 6 pages as I go through the document. And then we found great success with this idea about using design to guide the voter. It's an expansion of that idea of those running headers and explaining to people at the top of a page what they're going to find on that page. We built these illustrations that illustrate the 3 ways to vote in our prototype. So this idea about voting by mail, voting early in person, and voting at the polls in person. We developed simple illustrations for those, but rather than just having them be sort of one-off clip art, we built those into navigational system that built through the document. So there's a graphic for vote by mail, and then it gets used in the header of every page that it's explaining the process of voting by mail, so on and so forth. So we're using that design consistently. So if they start to recognize that element from the 3 ways to vote page, they can begin to recognize it at the top of the pages they may be interested in finding. And then, a lot of counties are already doing this, and the rest of you are probably looking at various ways to do it, but we want to make sure and explain that we think it's a absolute best practice to include a practice ballot within these voter guides. Our ideal best practices on that are presenting that sample ballot in the way that voters will actually see it when they go to the polling place. In a perfect world, that would be the exact ballot with all the same splits and precincts and whatnot as they'll receive at their polling place. We understand that's goes above and beyond what most budgets can handle in terms of printing custom voter information guides, but certainly presenting a ballot in as close to the real form that it will exist as possible so that voters can familiarize themselves with that, take away some of the confusion factor or the fear factor of what might be on that ballot when they arrive, and so when they get to the polling place, they're already familiar with that.
So we'll take a brief Q&A section here for the layout and navigation portion. Not seeing any questions right now. So we could go ahead and move on to the next section, and please feel free to go ahead and type in your questions, and we'll unmute you.
The second section here is about icons and illustrations. This is about using information, using visual information to convey what voters are seeing as they work through the document, and making sure that we're using those to help them along their way. Before I forget to say it, Jan or Whitney will cover it at the end as well, but all the icons and illustrations you're going to see here in this document that are in the prototype best practices guide are available for download currently off of the Center for Civic Design website. So there's at least a starter set that people can use to begin with if they find them helpful. Our first guide on that is this idea about making the information visual. So we can use icons and illustrations to help guide people through all of the data. These voter information guides contain a great deal of written data, as you already know, columns and columns of text. What we can do is help give them in the case of icons, a very simple structure to start guiding them through the information. So when there's different types of information on a page, we can consistently use these icons to identify those pieces. So especially you'll see in our prototype where there's a page cover or a back cover that has a lot of different pieces of data on it, we'll use these icons to guide the voter to the right place. So if they're looking for accessibility information, they can go straight to the icon. If they're looking for telephone information, they can go straight to that icon. And we recommend using those icons consistently through a document. Every time there's telephone, call in, receive info kind of information, using that icon next to it so that a reader can scan through the document and easily find those spots where there might be ways to get further information via telephone, for instance. And then the other thing we've done in that prototype, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is building these illustrations that are not so much about tiny direct icons, but a little bit clearer visual information. These can help just provide a visual context about the larger concepts we're getting across. So icons are simple because you can put the web online icon next to every time you're listing a web address. These are slightly broader concepts where you're talking about the idea of voting by mail or voting early. But as I noted, we recommend using these consistently throughout the document. So essentially, like an icon, every time you're talking about voting by mail, show that vote by mail icon somewhere associated with that content, make it really relevant, and putting it in a spot where a voter can literally skim that document and start to see that repetitive image everywhere there's relevant information about voting by mail. We recommend staying away from the idea of any kind of illustration or even photography that's decorative or doesn't serve the purpose. The idea of these illustrations is about being very utilitarian in terms of identifying specific kinds of information. And then in terms of illustrations that become instructional, what we recommend is using instructional illustrations as often as possible because they help out larger percentages of the population. They really expand the knowledge they show instead of just telling, so that low literacy and general population voters both get a better understanding of how this process goes, and really even takes away some of that fear factor of what is the process going to be if I go into the poll and I need to sign the roster, then mark the ballot and place the ballot in the secrecy folder. We do recommend making sure those illustrations are accurate in their details because people tend to take those illustrations very literally. So we see a lot of voters getting confused if we've shown connect the arrow ballots even in their microscopic form in the illustrations, but they're in a county that uses fill-in ovals instead, or where we start to show something that looks too specifically like a pen, but they're provided a pencil when they walk in. So we just suggest noting a word of caution in terms of making sure you're paying attention to some of the details about those pieces and keeping them as accurate as possible. That said, we also recommend against using photography for this kind of scenario because photography ends up containing too much detail, which ends up obfuscating the point rather than clarifying it. If there's too much detail in these instructional illustrations, the reader tends not to know what to focus on because everything seems important in a photograph. You're not quite sure whether or not you're supposed to be paying attention to where the line gets connected or how the ballot's put into the sleeve.
Thanks, Drew. It looks like we don't have any questions just yet. I think folks are still mulling over all the great information you're providing. I did want to add, in the first webinar we had pointed out that a lot of the research and information that we gathered from all 58 counties, as well as the interviews that we conducted with current voters and potential voters, future voters, there were those three big insights that we mentioned around layout and visual design, which Drew is currently going over. But also the other two include civic literacy, closing the civic literacy gap, and the third being the importance of plain language. So as you can see, they kind of all intertwine to a certain extent. these icons and illustrations that Drew just went over, it helps reinforce the issues that folks may have with literacy, as well as civic education gaps that folks may have. People need a little bit more hand-holding to understand the election process.
Yep.
So that's why these icons and illustrations are really helpful for folks to just follow along in the voter guide.
Hey, Jen, we do have a question from Kim Alexander about the practice ballot and how it's presented in the guide. I'm going to unmute you, Kim, so you can ask your question yourself.
Oh, thanks. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Yep.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this webinar. It's just great. I've always found it really jarring that the sample ballot is laid out in a different direction than the rest of the sample ballot booklet, and I just wondered if that's something that you guys have thought about, or if that's not really a concern for other readers of the ballots, and if there's if there's any way around that, or if the whole guide should be pointed in the same direction if the ballots have to be laid out in that direction to make them fit.
We actually went back and forth on that, and we in the materials we have posted online, and we will have the web link up at the end of the seminar. We actually show it both ways. When we turn the ballot so that it's vertical, just like the page, it of course gets a lot smaller, and that makes it harder to read when it's small. When we turn it sideways, it's full size, but it's sideways. So there's kind of pluses and minuses on either side. But there was one thing that happened early on in some of the testing that did actually kind of weigh in on this, which is that when the ballot was turned vertically so that the voter came to it in a normal reading order and didn't have to switch the page, they often began reading the top of the ballot and said, well, I've just seen how to vote, that page with instructions on how I'm going to vote, and now I'm reading the same instructions again. And they just kind of leaped right into the ballot as more content rather than seeing it as a special piece of the guide. So we're still working on a couple of things around how do you make sure that in the context of this book that they're getting mailed, that it's really clear which part of it is the sample ballot, or as we like to say, the practice ballot. Because we found people going, sample, does that mean it's, what does sample mean in this context? But
yeah.
the real point, of course, is that they can take it out, they can practice voting on it, they can make sure they're ready, they can kind of rehearse for voting.
Yeah, I made a note of that practice ballot term too. I also really like it. I'm glad you mentioned that, Whitney. I do think sample ballot is one of those phrases that is sort of election jargon that we all hear and other people don't hear all the time. So thank you for explaining that.
And I just want to add, so when we were interviewing folks who are new to the election process or have never participated before, folks did take things quite literally. So it's confusing, but what we found was that they definitely appreciated having the actual ballot in some form, whether it's completely replicated and marked up so that it is clear that it's a practice ballot, because I think some folks even got confused that they filled one out and they had voted and that was that. But it definitely helped folks understand. One voter in particular memorized the location of where certain candidate races were or the ballot measures were, and instead of taking that sample ballot, practice ballot in with them to the polling booth, they literally memorized how they were going to vote and did it in that order based on how the layout was presented. So it's important to make sure that they are similar, if not exact. And that was a pretty fascinating discovery as well. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Whitney?
No, I was going to ask Drew if he had any thoughts about the challenges of squashing a large format paper onto a small format booklet.
Yeah, it's only a trick, Kim. You're onto something. It's a pros and cons for both scenarios question. For us, from a usability standpoint, it was about pushing legibility and size of type. So it's about utilizing the space the best we can to get the largest practice ballot on the page, even knowing that the shortcoming of that ends up being this kind of uneasy 90-degree turn of the page.
All right. I see that Monica Toronis has her hand up. I'm going to unmute you, Monica. Does that mean you have a question? Oh, it may have been a random click. There is a way you can indicate that you want to raise your hand to talk. If I've missed you, we can come back to you later. Well, shall we go on to typography?
Great. Last but not least is the typography section of this. As the designer type nerd token in the group, this is part of my required contract. It's part of my writer, along with taking all the green M&Ms out of the bowl that they have to put in my dressing room. They agree to let me talk about typography for a while. It ends up being that this plays a pretty important role in the usability of these voter information guides. So the broad rule we're talking about is making text as legible and easy to read as possible. The simplest rule about that ends up being make the text big enough. This sounds like an oversimplified rule about the scenario, but in reality, big enough in our world translates into essentially as big as possible. So we all really know that idea about small print at the end of legal contracts and the like. Pages of small, tightly packed text are just impossible to read, and they get more and more difficult to read if you're a low literacy reader, etc. So we know that our readers are more likely to read larger text as it goes. It's just easier for all kinds of readers, including the general population. So what we tell everyone as a guideline is this idea about trying to make the text at least 12-point size as you're building documents. We understand, again, this is one of those scenarios where page size, document length, printing costs make this difficult to always meet that guideline, but we'd certainly suggest that you try for it as often as possible. One of the ways you can actually do that is as we look to the future webinars later this week that'll start to talk about plain language. We can actually shorten language by making it clearer and easier to read, which gives us a little more space to get type sizes up as well. We strongly recommend using upper and lowercase letters, and that is presented as in contrast to setting things in all capital letters. There's a thought process along the way that it seems logical that important things, bold things, headlines get easier to read as they're set in all capitals. In fact, there's legislation in a great number of states across the nation that actually requires certain sections of text on ballots or in voter information guides to be set in all capital letters right there in the legislation. But what we find in terms of reading speed and reading comprehension is that setting things in upper and lowercase letters makes things easier to recognize, easier to follow, quicker to read. So there's a quick sample here on this slide that you can see where essentially our brain learns to read the silhouettes of letter shapes. And so type that's set in all capitals creates a silhouette that's an unrecognizable block, whereas type that's set in upper and lowercase gives us some visual cues about the letters that stick above that baseline and below that baseline. We also encourage you to avoid centered type. It always seems like a great idea to take the most important type on a page or at the top of a ballot and center it. But what happens is type becomes significantly easier to read as it's left aligned. That's because as we read left to right in the English language and Spanish and the like, we start at the left and read to the right. If our brain knows that we can always go back to the same exact starting point, that left alignment line, we can actually read quicker and with better comprehension than if we have to stop and our brain has to spend another millisecond to figure out where the start of the next line is. In centered type, the start of the next line is always shifting back and forth as it goes, depending on the length of the line. Designers like to joke that centered type is acceptable only on wine bottles and wedding invitations. Last but not least, maybe last, yeah. Pick one sans serif font. Sans serif font is a funny little technical name designers have for any of the fonts that don't have feet on them. So if you look at Times New Roman, it has little ears, feet, noses that stick off of a lot of the ends of the line. Sans serif font's more like an Arial or a Helvetica that you find on your computer. are in these lengths of text easier to read for this kind of content. You'll see a lot of novels set in serif fonts because it may be easier to read depending on the study about for very long amounts of text, but in the kinds of text we're talking about in a voter information guide, those sans serif typefaces are easier to read. The other is that we encourage you to pick that one typeface and stick with it because if you shift fonts through a document, the reader always has to stop and wonder just a little bit in the back of their head why this typeface changed from this one to this one to this one as you go. So we encourage you to stay consistent with that typeface. Here's a short crib sheet on picking that one sans serif font as you're going. Our prototype guide uses a typeface called Clearview ADA, built by Terminal Design. We use it because it's essentially the gold standard of the most legible typeface available. They've run studies on it across the nation to figure out that it functions as really the most legible typeface we know. They actually started by building it for highway signage, and there's a number of states that have started employing it on all of their highway and interstate signage because it's the most legible from a distance, moving quickly with low vision and the like. But it's not going to be preloaded on any of your machines, and your printers also may not have it. So another good set of suggestions that may be available to you are certainly the standards Helvetica and Arial, or if you have them, Universe and Verdana. You can see these are all quite similar to one another. You may or may not even be able to tell the difference between them. Some of us like to think they're wildly different, but these would all serve you very well in the context of a voter information guide.
Oops. So we're going to open the phones for question. And Kim, I'm afraid I just deleted your question by accident. Could you retype it for me?
I'll go ahead and say it. It says, how does someone get Clearview font?
Oh, Clearview font is from a company called Terminal Design. It's a single, relatively inexpensive license. And it was designed specifically with open letter forms that are helpful for people with some forms of reading disabilities. One of the things that I've been following some of the research around typography and reading. It turns out that a lot of the things that make it hard for some kinds of people to read are actually visual disabilities that show up as reading disabilities. So if your eyes don't track well across a page, then getting back to the beginning of the line is difficult, and adding a little more space between the lines so the letters aren't also cramped together helps make it easier to read. Similarly, contrast is good for people whose vision may be not as good as discriminating certain colors or certain shades from each other. So all the things that make the text crisp and easy to read also help with accessibility, which is why it's interesting that this font, which we really like, not only do we like the look of it, if you notice on this last screen, it's actually a slightly shorter line length, which means you get a little bit more words on the line, which us writers like, but it also has some good accessibility properties to it.
We've got a question. If we can go back one slide, got some folks that want to see the names here. Great. Okay, if you have a question, because your hand is raised, please let us know. You can go ahead and type it into the box. We've got a question from Daniel Rocha. See if we can unmute you.
There you go. We did it at the same time. There you go, Daniel. Off and running. Daniel, do you want to ask your question? Okay, the question is, in terms of bullet point shapes, Drew, do you recommend round, square, or diamond bullet points?
That's a great question. It feels like something you ask just to appease the nerdy designer in the group. The answer is I don't know that we've done any amount of research on it, and it probably does not matter too much. I would say, back to my original point, I would use that whichever you choose consistently through the document. The main point is about making sure that If you're using square bullets, use them everywhere. If you're using round bullets, use them everywhere. Or if there really is some sort of distinction in information between the things being listed with square bullets and round bullets, just use them consistently throughout the document.
Yeah, and I would say if you're using the shape of the bullet to make a difference, you better make it you better emphasize it with, shape and color and size, and make sure that it's not, that people don't just think it's a typographical, quirk. Well, Drew, let me ask you a question, because we're constantly throwing lots of text at you and saying, well, here's this big page of stuff, and we want it all to be on one page. And how much, I guess my question is, what are some of can you talk a little bit about some of the things you've done in the guide to help fit things on the page when there's maybe a little more text than we'd like? Do you make text smaller first? Do you make the margins smaller? Do you come back and beg us to cut the text?
Well, we always start by asking you to cut the text. In terms of the checklist of how you would move down that, I would tell you we do tend to start by making the text smaller by very small increments, because I think you can get away with a little bit more of that than if you start to play around with some things like margins or even line spacing. As you shrink line spacing, it can have an even more detrimental effect on legibility than shrinking type size. And as you start to push type too close to the edges of the page by narrowing your margins, you do that same sort of thing where you've created a space that's really hard to engage in terms of getting all the way across a page when there's almost no margin or breathing room on the page. So that's probably the way we go. Try and shorten copy. Try to size down copy a little bit, then maybe look into shifting margins or potentially line spacing, although all the election officials that are listening will see that we've also taken the liberty of letting some information spread onto a couple of pages instead of just one page if necessary, so that we're not creating a problem where we've sized it down so much that it's just illegible.
Right. Well, maybe we should move forward and just talk about some of the resources that are available to you besides this webinar and where you can get them, and make sure that everybody knows where that is before we run out of time.
That's great. As we pointed out earlier today, we had our first webinar. You will be able to see that as well as this webinar and the presentations online at cavotes.org. The last two webinars will be this Friday, which will talk more about the civic literacy gap and how to close that using the voter guides, as well as how to use plain language in the voter guides. And all of this information is coming out of our manual, the Best Practices Manual for Official Voter Information Guides. And the link is there also at cavotes.org. And coming out of that manual, one helpful tool that we'd like to pull out is the checklist. So this checklist actually goes through all of the insights and recommendations that are coming out of the research, and it's a handy tool that you can use when creating or revising your voter guide to once again hone in on the questions that voters need in order to feel confident and will be able to participate fully in our election.
And one of the things about this recommendation checklist is that it's not a list of things you must do. It's actually a list of questions to ask yourself, because we know that writing anything, especially something as complicated as a voter guide with all of the legal requirements, the vast amount of information that needs to be offered, the wide diversity of the audience, is always going to be about trade-offs and making sure that you've balanced objectives. And so this is really a series of questions to help you remember all the things that you need. It's 2 pages. You're seeing one of the first page here, but it doesn't just say do it this way. And all of the other information that's not in the manual is on the Center for Civic Design website, and that includes all the icons and illustrations that we used in our prototype are available online. They're in 3 formats, I think. There's a PSD format, which is a Photoshop format. They're in Illustrator, and they're in, or maybe they're in TIFF, and they're in something for the web. So they're in different sizes and quality, and some for print and some for web, ready to go and ready for you to use if you find them helpful. Plus, for those who really want to nerd out, all of the material that we gathered and all of our research reports, the preliminary research reports, are available online, including a landscape analysis that we did from the 2014 primary election, where we looked at all of the voter guides in the state, and all of those voter guides are online. So if you're looking for inspiration and ideas for what other counties are doing, or trying to just get a sense of how different or the same your county is from other counties, that's a great place to go look.
And we've got a question from Michael Canning. How long will it take for the recorded copies of the webinars to appear? Well, our goal is to get these all up, well, at least these 2 from today up before the next webinars on Friday. And of course, the webinars on Friday will be up early next week. We'll turn them around as quickly as possible, and of course, everyone who has registered for any of the webinars, you'll be notified once they're all up, and just a reminder of how you can get all this helpful information online. Once again, all of our websites are listed and who we are. Thank you again for joining us. We hope to, well, thank you if you've joined us twice today, and we hope to see you online again on Friday. Have a good rest of the week. Thank you.